To the curious, the seekers, and also to the experts, welcome. You're listening to Poli-Psych Podcast. Since Julian Assange was released from or thrown out of the Ecuadorian embassy, we thought that we would chat a little bit about Julian Assange, his release, and the potential of what might indeed happen from this point on, and contributions that he has made or problems that he has caused. So with me is Ken, our MBTI expert. Hello, Ken.
Hey, Cindy.
And Don, our Enneagram expert. Hiya, Don.
Hey, you upgraded us from a advocate, or what was the word, to an expert. We're now experts?
Specialist. Well,
okay.
I guess you graduated. Congratulations. We'll have a party later.
Woo-hoo. All right.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad to be here. This will be interesting.
I do have a very brief clip of Julian Assange leaving the embassy, which I will roll. It's quite sad. He looks like he's in really rough shape. But here comes that clip.
After 7 years of asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy, the Ecuadorian government released Assange to British authorities, and he could now face charges in the U.S.
So poor Julian, he looks really rough. He looks like somebody in a film that's, portraying somebody who has been in solitary confinement for an extended period of time. I'm thinking of Steve McQueen in Papillon.
Yeah, and you have to think about what would make somebody do this. Realize that he could have walked out of this embassy at any time. Nobody was forcing him to be there. It was just the fact that he knew that extradition would await him and legal proceedings would await him. And he was really taking a stand that was very, very costly to him. In terms of the Enneagram, I don't want to speak to his personal type or character, but what I see happening here is what I would call a one script, meaning that the values and the ideals that are being lived out here very much fit within the one space of the Enneagram. And this is the typically the type that is the strongest in standing up for something they believe is right or wrong. Ones are all about ethical standards, and that might make you think, well, they all have to be good people. Well, not necessarily true. Criminals can have ethical standards, and there's a high degree of, or high percentage, or as just the same as the natural population, most likely, of Enneagram 1 types in prison. They have codes of ethics too. But this is a journalist who has stood up for his code of ethics at a very high cost, and what awaits now is to find out whether or not he has number one, whether or not he finds an avenue to have his stance fairly adjudicated in the United States, and number two, we'll find out whether his stance was right or wrong in the court of public opinion.
The situation harkens back to the Pentagon Papers case, and I think if this does hit the courts, that precedent will come up. And you see, Julian Assange, there are a variety of takes on the MBTI profile and on INTJ as being very, very credible conclusion. Terms the introverted feeler, and what that would mean is that internally very solid, usually can screen out the group ethos a little better at hunkering down, believing in the direction that they found in themselves, the fortitude to pull through a situation that's been really an imprisonment. It's no different from a house arrest, even though it was under terms of asylum. And in practical terms, it might have even be worse than a prison. He didn't have any access to sunlight, vitamin deficient, and so on. I'd say that the charge that that they're contemplating actually, I believe, was pardoned. The conviction that Chelsea Manning had was thrown out. So that was his, that freed him, and he was pulled back in, I believe, for conspiracy, although I don't really understand the legal details.
I wanted to say something about the timing of this, because I think that really relates to the whole event. And of course, we're actually just in the means of trying to give some context to this event. But I think it's important to note that why now? Why is Julian being forced to be extradited to the United States now? And it has to be the pressure that was put on the Ecuadorian government. That's what caused this, that they're going to not be able to hold him because of the consequences to Ecuador are going to be more than Ecuador is willing to pay. But that card could have been played at any time, as I see it. I don't know any reason why it couldn't have, but I think the most obvious explanation is that the timing isn't coincidental. It's right after the Mueller report was completed, and it's right after Attorney General Barr has been confirmed. So I think that the Trump administration feels that it is now in control of the justice system, and we'll have to see how that plays out. But my guess is that is what's involved here in the timing.
Yeah, that seems to, the AG Barr era has started, and I think President Trump has shaken the box, and whatever chain of events led to this happening, it seems to fit with just the trend of clearing out the pipeline, getting the Justice Department actually functioning again, because it literally had been not functioning in any way, shape, or form. I'm still part of the plan, at least for Sessions, as far as he essentially was a DC tourist for almost all of his tenure, the Easter egg roll.
At least for what we know at this time, what he did. There's a possibility that he had been doing some things that won't be known until later. And I do hold out that possibility. I think the jury's going to take a while.
I do too. I think the plan, if there was a plan, would have been to let the Mueller investigation establish standards and practices for proceeding in investigations that can now be theoretically turned upon the opposition. Precedent, but the template for Assange to be the embassy seems to be timely, especially with the lull in the election cycle, and it just rose to the top of the pile. But I think Julian Assange is charged with an offense that I think has a 5-year sentence attached to it, which is not, in the grand scheme of things, it's definitely not as serious as espionage, which I don't even know if they can charge him with that not being a citizen. I don't know the legalities on that. But again, Chelsea Manning was pardoned. And I think if it did hit the court, Scott Adams mentioned this today in his podcast, that if it does hit the courts, the attorneys can always say, well, this same charge, the star witness was pardoned for the same crime by the President Obama. The problem with Julian Assange has always been the asymmetrical influence that one person can have, and whether or not that's a good thing. And I'm kind of on the fence with that. It's hard. It's a very difficult issue, but I point my finger more towards how did conditions deteriorate that led to the defection of Chelsea Manning, that led to the defection of Snowden. And if we're going to drag the person who accepted the information, would not it be also judicially and ethically sound to apply the same standards to the cause of this happening in the first place?
It seems that way, and I think a big question is really that's kind of central to the whole issue is, how did WikiLeaks get the information that was the from the email servers, the Podesta emails, and some of the other emails that really did? I mean, objectively looking back, I remember October of 2016. Those emails did have a huge impact on that election. They were very timely, it released a very timely fashion. I would not say election meddling, because I think that all of us has a right to be, a First Amendment right, to be just a force of, speaking out. So I wouldn't call it election meddling, but But it certainly made a difference, I believe.
Only problem, it's kind of hard. It was hard for me to accept at first, but the presence leaves open the possibility for what you would call information laundering, where you could have a quid pro quo arrangement between two entities to use the Julian Assange out as a way to pay off on the information side of it. Then the financial part happens in a different area. So I think the same standard is sometimes applied to cryptocurrency, being this sort of dark web way of exchanging consideration. And this is why it was sort of a problem. Again, it's one area and we don't know what's happening under the hood. What's the feeling on the whole? I know this is always a touchy subject, but the Seth Rich.
Yeah, well, I think that is definitely related, and I strongly suspect that if there is a desire to find out more about that there will be found a way to ask Julian Assange about it. I think this is in the realm of law, but I think that's important to know, that people would want to know his understanding of where that information came from, and whether or not it is Seth Rich. And Assange has had, under the WikiLeaks banner, a policy of not revealing sources, but once it gets down to legal proceedings, the veil has been pierced, so to speak, and if there is legal grounds to know what Assange knows, and the WikiLeaks, before Assange was in the embassy, there had been, or maybe it was even after, there was a reward that was offered for any information about the death of Seth Rich. So there's definitely some connections there that I think if we want to know the truth of what happened, it will be interesting to see how all this proceeds on a legal basis. Yeah, important questions.
And they never caught the murderer of this person, essentially executed on the streets of Washington, D.C. It was not a robbery. At least they can't conclude that it was. I guess you could say it was a botched robbery, yet there was nothing taken. So it's just, there's a lot of open doors with this, and it's on this show we're probably not going to go into any theoretical, but it's just, as a citizen, I'm still concerned with the fact that this is an unsolved crime. That they never have apprehended a killer. So I don't know. It's disturbing.
I wanted to echo what you were saying, Ken, just now about the under the hood and the pieces that are unseen. And this feels very much like a chess match. And Assange has been an important piece that hasn't been played until now. And we do know that there is a war going on between intelligence agency factions, not only within the United States, but around the world. And Assange is part of that because he has classified information. He has been given that information. So he becomes a very important chess piece. And it's being played now. And that's a dynamic that I think we all have to consider when we're looking at this. This is not just a person that is operating on his own. This is international intrigue at its most visible. And the fact that we recognize that is going on also means why now, from another perspective, is could this be a distraction, as you, I think, implied, or something happening in the financial system or in another arena that needs some cover in order to not suck up the news cycle, because it sure looks like Assange is going to suck up the news cycle for a while now.
There's definitely intrigue surrounding all this, and because it's difficult to gather information about Assange. There is an esoteric source called Q who claims, or it may be a team, to be somehow connected to military intelligence. Now, this is all very subjective, and of course, there's no way to prove it. This source, Q, has written some what's called drops by the group who follow Q regarding Seth Rich and Julian Assange. One is Q Post 1195, SR Connect to DNC, MS13, JA, and of course JA represents Julian Assange, SR represents Seth Rich. Why did the Ds push legal rep on family? And this was from April of 2018, and it says June ETA Q, which obviously there was not a June ETA for any information. There's another Q post that might be of interest, 1626. Server or JA equals truth exposed. SR, Ds are in crisis mode. One is bigger than you can imagine. Putin, Uranian 1 will come out post-summit. These people are corrupt beyond belief. America for sale. And I do just also want to mention Bill Binney. We haven't touched on that yet. Bill Binney absolutely states that based on his research,
former NSA player,
quite well positioned to know things. He has stated that it's based on the bits and bytes from the computers, the zeros and the ones, it is not possible that the server was hacked, that the information had to have been moved via some kind of physical, like a thumb drive or something in that nature.
For someone with ultra high bandwidth, and I think that was the part that Kim.com may have played. I mean, that's how the theory works. I don't like using the word conspiracy theory, but because we're in the theoretical realm, and there's just no way to get around that. I know that I've pushed to put that value judgment on this process, but we do need this process of sort of brainstorming the spectrum of possibilities. And that's when Q is useful. Almost any source is useful just in opening the mind to different possibilities, which is really a form of intuition that we're dealing with. So in the absence of concrete information, it becomes an intuitive world. And this is why there is a place, I think, for this sort of speculative musing. Even Q will open doors that people never considered possible. It doesn't really matter if it's true or not. It's just the fact that, well, here's a population that can expand their thinking to the point where they're ready for any challenge or any change in the wind. And it makes people pay attention to the concrete, even though it is abstract, but you're ready for that concrete. You've trained your mind to look in the right places.
I agree that Q is valuable for those reasons, Ken. And I think Cindy's going to pull up Q 1595, and that was the one that I think is the easiest, most pertinent reference to Julian Assange, where the Q team is saying to the deep state, you may have the site, but we have the source. And that refers to the site being WikiLeaks and the source being Assange. And so Q team definitely comes out with facts, but a lot of times the facts don't make sense until later. And I think that's a really interesting straddling or a mixing between the intuitive and the sensing. That it appears intuitive at first because you can't connect the dots, but later on, once all the data is available and news has covered certain things and people are aware of certain things, and a lot of times these Q posts make a lot more sense later on. And of course, this particular one is in June 27th of 2018. So now I think that is really making a lot of sense. That's I think a good way to treat this as being information that we have to avoid making value judgments on until we know more about it.
President Trump appears to be maintaining a posture of aloofness regarding Julian Assange. It obviously is coming to a head in ways that we didn't anticipate a few months ago even. And I think that will be the sort of the keystone of this year, this sort of intra-cycle, 2019, the year before the 2020, when old threads, these old issues will begin to resolve themselves in ways we may not be able to predict right now at this point in time. They'll just emerge, in ways that nobody expects. It's a fascinating time.
Yeah, interesting observation there about President Trump. Is kind of not getting involved right away, and of course, I think that makes sense if you consider him as an Enneagram 3 who wants to read the people, know the lay of the land before he ventures out there. And sometimes it might appear that President Trump does the opposite, but he's actually, in other words, kind of shoot from the hip. But I don't believe he's in any of President Trump's infamous tweets. He's really shooting from the hip. He's actually taken very careful measurement of the pulse of where different groups of people are at, and he's putting something out there to lead things in a direction that he wants them to go. And a lot of times that is actually making people upset, or getting people to react emotionally, because he knows then they'll make mistakes. That's, I think, one of his strategies. But with regard to Assange, this is an area where there are valuable political players on both sides of the issue, people that really like Assange and people that believe that he's really a subversive element to governments worldwide. So I think there are probably President Trump supporters that are on both sides of that issue. So it makes sense for him to be quiet about this and let the legal process work.
Well, President Trump has been on both sides of the issue. I think before the election or during the campaign, he had said positive things about Julian Assange. Now it's his obligation as chief executive to safeguard the security of the classified information structure. So he's kind of flip-flopped there a little bit. But Julian Assange himself was not a fan of Hillary Clinton. Seemed to be somewhat benign towards President Trump. Not always, but most of the time.
Yeah, Assange was asked why doesn't WikiLeaks publish things against President Trump, and he has responded, "We don't have any."
InfoWars covered this the release today, though, and they slowed down the film, and I think their audio editing people did some work to try to find out what it was exactly that Julian Assange said when he was being taken out and placed in the vehicle. And they believed that what he said is resist Trump, resist Donald Trump, and resist something else that was unclear. But he seemed to be, according to what their audio editing people pulled out, they believe that he was feeling quite hostile toward President Trump at the time of his release. Who knows what he's been told while he was stuck there, though?
He had a book, I think it was a Gore Vidal book. I don't recall the title, but he was holding that up at one point. That one.
Yes, I noticed that too. I saw the stories about that and the implications of it. One of the things that's worth noting, as far as Julian Assange's background, is that I'm not sure if he considers himself an anarchist, but many people view him as such because he basically believes that governments should not have any secrets, that doesn't really recognize that there is such a thing as legitimate national security. Now, I'm open to correction on that, but I believe that that's pretty close to his stance, and it's not hard for me to see why government, military would view him as a very dangerous person. So I try to be neutral on him. I see a lot of his stuff that he has dealt with as being of the whistleblower category, and certainly that's what WikiLeaks was on the face of it designed to do. But we want to be careful not to, I think, make Julian Assange into whatever we want him to be. We have to look into his actual views and reasons. And I would not be terribly surprised if he turns out to be very anti-Trump, but that wouldn't sway me really too much one way or the other about him. or about President Trump?
I think if I was to classify his political behavior, it probably is closest to the Libertarian Party or that general complex of polemicism. And historically, I think that was very true. Going back to the Ron Paul era, the permeability between those two, it was fairly open. It was before the time when things really blew out of proportion, as they have with the victory of President Trump, which upset the entire equilibrium in the U.S. and set about the Russian conspiracy theory, and that of course had to involve Assange, because he's this sort of gray area where you can paste anything you want onto the. We really don't know where the DNC emails came from, whatever the theory ends up being. But this is one of the problems and one of the annoyances with the Assange case has been this 4-year black hole of just uncertainty about one person having this kind of asymmetrical influence in government that well. You can't. It's a tough issue, and I'm still wondering how we got to this point where we did have the defections. We had the defection of Snowden, which probably is more significant, and you just can't have that happening in a military structure. I think the commanders would have to be in charge of that. Is just not putting their service people into situations where they can be compromised by their own internal convictions. And that was actually written into the military command structure, is about fulfilling an order that you find, I forget how that's worded in the Uniform Military Code of Conduct, but it is an issue, and it should be looked into, I think, because I think all of us as Americans, loyal Americans, want a military structure that is cohesive and is not able to turn over at will based on their own personal feelings. Classified information, circumstances under which that would happen need to be avoided also, where if there are immoral orders being put out there, then it will happen again.
Yeah. Whenever any organization becomes corrupt, and military and intelligence included, there is a need for whistleblowers to expose that corruption. And some people want to paint Assange as a complete white hat, that's what he's doing, and that might be true. But I think we have to wait until all of the facts come out and we find out what's really going on. Let the justice system do its work. And again, I think it's important, the timing that this has happened. I believe that it's a good sign that President Trump has waited this long to have Assange extradited, and that he has confidence more so in the justice system now than before.
And I think my closing comment would be a prediction that Julian Assange essentially walks free. I know it may not seem like that today, but again, the charge that they're bandying about is a 5-year offense, and with proper representation, he'll probably wiggle out of it, and as a non-citizen would not be charged with certain offenses that are capital crimes. So we'll see what happens, and I think it's just good to get this behind us.
I think that that one aspect of all this that's related is transparency in government, and not perhaps that the military must reveal all their secrets. That's probably not very practical, but a clear chain of command under which decisions are made, I think, would be helpful. And I believe that we've departed from that as a nation quite some time ago. And intelligence agencies and rogue this, and supposedly there are secret programs that are too secret for the president to know about, or so that he has plausible deniability, whatever. I don't believe that's appropriate. I believe that we need to have transparency and clear chain of command, and that in the future that will help prevent some of these kinds of things from happening, although we probably will always have whistleblowers. So, Don, do you have any parting comments?
I'm pretty much done with my last comment.
Very well. Then, in that case, to the curious, the seekers, and also to the experts, thank you for joining us for this look at Julian Assange, what is happening with him now, and what may be happening with him in the near future. Please remember to like this video. Click like if you have indeed liked it. Please subscribe to our channel so that you will not miss an episode, which generally is released once per week. Again, we thank you and hope that you will take care. Till next time.